Russia has been fighting two wars against Ukraine. One is the war you can see, with all the missiles, the trenches, and the drone footage keeping it in the daily spotlight. But the other one is quieter, cheaper, and in many ways more ambitious. It's the war for what Ukrainians believe, and the war fought by people who carry no rank insignia and leave no official record. And that second war has been quietly testing Ukraine's will to fight, or at least it did until 2023. Today, that war has arguably failed, and the strategies that Russia used are now being turned against its own people. To understand where we are, you have to start with 2014 and an army that was never supposed to be there. In July 2014, Russian state television Channel 1 broadcast what it described as a refugee testimony. A woman named Galina Pishnyak, speaking from a camp in Russia's Rostov region, told viewers that Ukrainian soldiers had rounded up the residents of the city of Sloviansk. In the main square, where she dubbed Lenin Square, they had taken a 3-year-old boy, the son of a local pro-Russian militiaman, and they had crucified him, nailing him to a board like a public execution. His mother, she said, was tied to a tank and dragged around the square until she lost consciousness. The segment ran on the most watched channel in Russia, a state broadcaster that could feasibly reach 250 million viewers across the former Soviet countries. Within hours, the story was moving through Russian and Ukrainian social media. However, within a day, independent journalists had torn it apart. Investigative reporters from Novaya Gazeta and the independent TV channel Dost traveled to Sloviansk and found no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no audio or video of the alleged incident. This was entirely contradictory to what was expected, especially because Ukrainian army operations in that city were heavily documented at the time. BBC News pointed out a detail that should have stopped the story before it started. There is no Lenin Square in Sloviansk. The nearest equivalent is October Revolution Square. The location where the atrocity supposedly happened didn't even exist. Pishnyak herself was not what she appeared to be either. Her husband was a former member of the Berkut, the Ukrainian special police unit dissolved after the Maidan. By that point, he had already joined the separatist forces operating under Igor Strelkov. So, she wasn't a refugee, but was the wife of an active combatant on the Russian-backed side, giving testimony from a Russian camp on Russian state television about an atrocity that no physical evidence, no other witness, and no geographic reality could support. And while the story turned out to be nonsense, investigators found it worthwhile to track its source and how it came into existence. It appeared to have been seeded by the Eurasianist philosopher Alexander Dugin, who published a version of it on his Facebook page on July 9, 3 days before the Channel 1 broadcast. Dugin has written at length about the power of what he calls archetypes, or foundational cultural images that can be deployed to assign guilt and innocence. The choice of a small defenseless child as victim and crucifixion as the method drew on the deepest imagery of Christian martyrdom and combined it with the oldest anti-Christian tropes in history. It was designed to define Ukrainians not as political opponents, but as something inhuman. Curiously, what was happening in Sloviansk that week is likely what caused the story to be broadcast in the first place. A week before the broadcast, Russian-backed separatists had been forced to withdraw from Sloviansk by advancing Ukrainian forces. And the day before the broadcast, the Russian army began shelling Ukrainian positions in the Donbass from the territory of the Russian Federation itself. Both of those events were invisible in the Russian media. The crucified boy replaced them. A military retreat and an act of cross-border aggression were laundered in real time by a fabricated atrocity story. So, instead of Russian people being aware that their military was actively conducting hostile operations in another country, all they saw was an attempt to vilify the people who are arguably closest to them in terms of culture and history. Channel 1 eventually issued something resembling a retraction on December 21, 2014, a whopping 5 months after the broadcast, saying it had merely relayed a purported eyewitness report. Note how that wasn't an apology for reporting a fake story. It took until 2021, when a Russian journalist named Masha Baznova tracked Pishnyak down, where she said she regretted fabricating the story. But the damage had been done. When the Russian army formally invaded eastern Ukrainian force later in the summer of 2014, its soldiers gave reporters a reason for why they had come. According to journalists who interviewed returning volunteers from the Luhansk People's Republic in 2015, some of them cited the crucifixion story directly. They said they were in Ukraine for the children. The missiles Russia later fired at the Kramatorsk railway station in 2022, killing children, were labeled with the same phrase. A story debunked within 24 hours was still recruiting combatants a year later and still providing moral cover 8 years after that. It was the pinnacle of a successful disinformation campaign. Regardless of the story's validity, the people believed it long enough to produce consequences that would go on to reshape public opinion and even global geopolitics. The crucified boy was only the surface. Beneath it, Russia had been running a separate and far more operational campaign. Beginning in 2014, as part of the broader hybrid aggression that accompanied the seizure of Crimea and the manufactured uprising in Donbass, Russian intelligence services, mainly the FSB and the GRU, built and activated agent networks across southern and eastern Ukraine. The objective was to destabilize Ukraine by provoking interregional and interethnic conflict, strengthening separatist forces, and removing security structures. Ultimately, the measures would lay the groundwork for a political collapse that would make military intervention either unnecessary or trivially easy. It's partially what had already happened with the annexation of Crimea in early 2014, and what should have happened with Kyiv in February 2022. Research published by the US Army War College's journal Parameters suggested that GRU Spetsnaz units were likely operating inside eastern Ukraine as early as mid-March 2014, roughly a month before the Donbass rebellion became full-blown. The unit of more than 50 militants that crossed the border and seized police and security buildings in Sloviansk and Kramatorsk on April 12, 2014, wore no insignia and was commanded by FSB Colonel Igor Gherkin, known by his call sign Strelkov. Western analysis also detected personnel from GR Unit 29155 in February 2022, days before the special military operation. The unit was later flagged as responsible for the Salisbury poisonings, arms depot explosions across Eastern Europe, and attempted political destabilization. The 2014 unrest in Odessa, which culminated in the trade union building fire that killed 48 people, was also described by Ukraine Security Service as the product of foreign interference, specifically groups from Moldova's Russian-controlled Transnistria region working alongside Russian finance networks. So, in Ukraine, Russia had an undercover operation with reach, budget, and years of preparation behind it. And for a time, it worked. The Donbass was set alight. Ukrainian security forces were staggered in the early months and caught between a conventional military threat and an insurgency that blurred the line between local grievance and a directed Russian operation. But the machine had a fundamental flaw, which was only uncovered by a Reuters investigation into the FSB's covert network in Ukraine. As it turned out, the agents and their handlers believed Ukraine was weak, which was a total misconception, despite nearly a decade of undercover disinformation campaigns in the country. People the Kremlin counted on as its proxies inside Ukraine had overstated their own influence for years, and the FSB was receiving assessments that reflected what Moscow wanted to hear, not what Ukrainian society actually looked like on the ground. This is why, when the full-scale invasion came in February 2022, the plan to seize Kyiv in 72 hours collapsed. The FSB had been tasked with preparing conditions for a swift political capitulation, including lists of friendly officials, pre-positioned agents, and the parts of the population expected to waver. What they found instead was a society that had spent 8 years hardening. The covert preparation that was supposed to make the military operation easy had been entirely fabricated, and as soon as Russia made an overtly aggressive move, the campaigns collapsed. Months after the failure in February 2022, the FSB pivoted from the ambition of taking Kyiv to occupying and converting the cities Russia had actually seized, like Mariupol, Melitopol, and Kherson. It was a smaller, grimmer version of the same program. FSB officials swept in behind advancing artillery, trying to build a governance structure on rubble and fear, present but diminished. One Ukrainian intelligence official described the new situation as the FSB working as not with the same enthusiasm, but they continue. The reason for that is that the information front changed drastically between 2014 and 2022. In mid-May 2026, Andriy Yusov, who is the representative for strategic communications of Ukraine's defense intelligence, or HUR, appeared on stage at the Lviv Media Forum. His assessment of Russia was that the penetration of Russian fakes into the Ukrainian information space and into the European one has become much smaller than it was in 2014. He continued by saying, "There is more critical reflex now. A great deal simply does not reach people, or it reaches them and does not catch. The reaction has become, this is obvious nonsense. Why would I even respond to it?" This is a striking thing for a serving intelligence official to say. The enemy has stopped trying, but the attempts are no longer landing on the intended target's consciousnesses. Ukrainian society, after 12 years of hybrid aggression and 4 years of full-scale war, has developed a discerning eye for Russian propaganda, outright rejecting Russian claims. So what does a propaganda apparatus do when its primary target has become immune? It finds a different use for the machine. Russia's disinformation apparatus has now turned inward. A separate category of content is now being produced exclusively for the domestic Russian audience. In fact, there's an ongoing debate on how Russia has increasingly started looking like North Korea in terms of media coverage. Reports of the North Koreanization, as it was later dubbed, began back in 2022, when news outlets discussed the rate at which the Kremlin governed Russian media content and what was told to the public. With the failures of a disinformation campaign inside Ukraine, the renewed FSB efforts only accelerated that trend domestically. So, The Crucified Boy has come back with sequels. The original story is being revived with characters from a Soviet-era children's television program, the kind multiple generations of Russians grew up with. A supposed sister has been added to the narrative, and there's even a version with the mother tortured and killed by Ukrainians. The new detail is similar to how a TV series adds seasons, because for that domestic audience, that's exactly what it functions as. The Kremlin is basically outputting serialized content for people who need a continuous supply of Ukrainian villainy to justify what their country is doing and what their families are losing. And when the initial fabrication aimed outwards fails, the remaining tactic is to make existing problems seem much worse, starting with one thing Ukraine actually has trouble with: manpower. In the first 10 days of May 2026, more than 21,600 posts pushing an anti-migrant narrative flooded Ukrainian social media across roughly 14,000 sources, concentrated on Facebook and Telegram. Among the evidence circulating was a doctored video clip of a regional official edited to make him appear to promise migrants preferential benefits. Ukraine's State Migration Service issued only 675 migration permits in the first quarter of 2026, and then went back and cancelled 445 of them. The intent behind the campaign was to abuse the fact that Ukraine is pushing heavily into bolstering its military forces with recruits. So Russia could then create an impression that Ukrainian cities are being flooded with foreign workers taking up the slack, with the underlying message being sent that Ukraine is fighting but will become less culturally cohesive anyway. This campaign runs on 2 tracks simultaneously. The first is to destabilize Ukraine from within. The second is to damage Ukraine's reputation in front of Western partner societies, making the coalition support politically costly and slowing the flow of aid. But similarly to how Ukraine pushed back when Russia was launching missiles and drones with its own missiles and drones, it did so with intelligence campaigns. While Russia was building its covert networks and its propaganda architecture, Ukraine was constructing a smaller, less resource, but considerably more surgical device. But before we get into that, did you know we make daily videos that analyze all aspects of the war in Ukraine and recent developments? So, make sure to hit the subscribe button to catch up and like the video if you want to see more of this topic. Back to Ukraine's efforts. Its Special Operations Forces, or SSO, maintain what they call a resistance movement infrastructure inside Russian-occupied territories. And in a rare interview with the Ukrainian outlet Hromadske in September 2024, an SSO soldier using the call sign Sasha described how it works. Sasha had been fighting Russia since 2014 and had spent the war years preparing undercover agents operating behind enemy lines, who would then recruit resistance movement members for reconnaissance, sabotage, subversion, and guerrilla activities in the Russian-occupied territories. According to Sasha, one of the SSO's primary goals is to increase the level of dissatisfaction with the occupation authorities. The missions these agents carry out range from painting pro-Ukrainian graffiti in occupied cities to destroying bridges, derailing supply trains, and assassinating Russian soldiers and collaborators. The SSO even has the documentation to protect them when conditions eventually change. Until then, they're fully classed as independent, and only a limited circle within the SSO knows that they're actually working for Ukraine. One of the most active components of this resistance architecture is Atesh, a pro-Ukrainian intelligence network that originated in Crimea in September 2022 and expanded significantly into the Kherson, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia regions after that. Atesh specializes in rail infrastructure sabotage and targeting military vehicles, and has been responsible for more than half of all documented sabotage incidents in occupied territories in the first half of 2025. Luckily for them, Ukraine's resistance has something that Russia doesn't: the ability to go much farther into the opposing territory. While Russia ostensibly uses social media to conduct undercover operations, Ukraine has smuggled drones, resulting in the famous Operation Spiderweb. It used 117 FPV drones concealed inside wooden prefabricated structures that resembled modular housing, loaded onto ordinary commercial trucks. A Ukrainian national then moved to Chelyabinsk in October 2024 and opened a freight business. In December, he acquired several trucks. Over the following months, the operation quietly positioned its payload across 5 air bases, 5 oblasts, spanning 2,500 miles from the Murmansk region on the Arctic coast to Irkutsk in Siberia, deep beyond the Ural Mountains. And in June 2025, those drones began emerging to inflict as much damage as they could. The targets were Alyonia, Diaghilevo, Ivanovo, Severny, Belaya, and Ukranka air bases. The aircraft destroyed or severely damaged included 2 95 MS strategic bombers, 2 22 M3 long-range strike aircraft, and at least 1 A-50 airborne early warning jet, which exists in extremely limited numbers and is no longer in production. Ukrainian officials assessed 41 aircraft as destroyed or damaged. Open source analysis estimated the cost to Russia was approximately $7 billion. Russian military bloggers described it as Russia's Pearl Harbor. The comparison is doubly important because it shattered the assumption that Russia could use the Far East to protect its most important assets. Russian authorities were even forced to massively militarize Moscow's Victory Day parade preparations in May 2026. The guest list shrank to its smallest in decades, with almost no heads of state invited. Instead of rolling tanks, the Kremlin simply showed military equipment on video, afraid they would get destroyed by Ukraine in the middle of Russia's capital city. The operation was also a demonstration that Ukraine's covert apparatus has become technically sophisticated enough to run an 18-month logistics chain inside hostile territory without detection. The same FSB that had been tasked with preparing Ukraine for Russian occupation failed to detect a 117-drone infiltration network operating inside Russia for a year and a half. And here's what that failure is costing Russia, and why the propaganda machine now has to work so hard. The Russian economy entered the war with significant energy revenues, accumulated reserves, and the ability to run a short war before the bill came due. The bill is now overdue. According to analysis from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, a German policy research institute, Russia's surge in GDP, driven by massive defense spending, stalled during 2024, while inflation remained. Russia enacted an increase in value-added tax from 20 to 22% starting January 2026, aiming to recoup a part of its government funding from the Russian economy itself. Meanwhile, the country is spending 40% of its budget on the military and national defense, and has even been forced to reduce the budget for 2026 in acknowledgement of not having enough money. Russia's arms export capacity has also collapsed in parallel. Exports dropped by 92% between 2021 and 2024, according to Jamestown Foundation analysis, as production was redirected toward domestic war consumption and Western sanctions restricted access to components. Countries that used to buy Russian equipment have shifted toward alternatives. Russia is building weapons for itself, and even then, they don't seem to be enough. However, Russia needs to maintain the illusion that it's winning the war, and that's done through the same propaganda machine that's been running for the past 4 years. As Russia keeps losing assets, the FSB needs to work overtime. Yusuf openly claimed that it's clear even to the FSB that Ukrainians and the Western media know that what Russia puts on display isn't the truth. but it has to try, and the more it does, the more it really starts looking like North Korea. The FSB's efforts might be a bit too shallow for the arguably most important people in the war, the soldiers on the front line. On the front lines, however, Ukraine has begun conducting effective psychological warfare. The I Want to Live project, run by Ukraine's coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war, alongside the Defense Ministry and military intelligence, gives Russian soldiers a route to surrender under the Geneva Conventions. The service runs through a 24-hour hotline, a Russian-language website, and a Telegram chatbot. It's drawn tens of millions of visits, the vast majority of them from inside Russia. Moscow has repeatedly blocked access to it, but those blocks keep getting circumvented. A companion service, I Want to Find, lets Russian families trace relatives killed or captured in Ukraine. These are relatively small teams producing reach in the millions. They're also among the few Ukrainian information operations that have demonstrably penetrated the Russian domestic information space. The fact that Russia is constantly trying to block them is proof. So, where does that leave us? In 2022, a large part of Ukrainian society and many Western observers genuinely believe that Russians simply didn't know the truth, that the right video, the right phone call, the right evidence would reach them and something would change. After years, it's clear that there's only so much you can achieve by trying to fight disinformation with information, especially when the former has been in effect for decades. So Ukraine arguably no longer needs to try to convert Russians. The I Want to Live campaign helps, but it's ultimately an attempt to soften Russia's frontline a bit. The focal point of the information war now is about maintaining credibility toward the people who matter. For Ukraine, this is the rest of the world, because if it stays demonstrably credible, the public will keep supporting it. But for Russia, this has become its own population, because 4 years of war have left it as a geopolitical pariah. And even that might not be enough, because the Kremlin is slowly losing one of its biggest regions, the Far East. To learn more, check out this video, and make sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more news on daily geopolitics.